Hey, good morning. So in this video, I would like to give a bit of a highish level overview towards some of the big shifts happening in the world today, the potential relationships between different countries, and some of the signals that we are getting at the moment, what that historically means, and what that can mean and what our potential options are for you and I. And just even if we don't decide to act on any of these signals, these insights, these potential clues, for me, it's just bringing awareness or having awareness to some of the big things happening in the world. And these big things often leave clues, and it can give us a second lens to look through to just help, yeah, really have just a second lens, a second opinion on some of the big things happening in the world today and the potential implications and the potential opportunities and what that can mean for the money we have in our bank, the value of that money, and really where purchasing power, you know, how we can actually buy stuff. It's all about purchasing power. What assets, what currencies, what instruments typically hold purchasing power, hold value, or lose it, leak it. So I want to start by talking about one of the big things happening, and it's been going on really for the last couple of years, and that is central banks around the world. So, in its most simplest form, a central bank really sits at the top of the banking food chain. Technically, you have the Bank of International Settlements above that, but to keep things nice and simple, you have the central bank really sits at the top of the banking food chain, and they are predominantly involved in controlling interest rates and issuing currency and speaking with other banks to basically control the flow of money in the system in its most basic, simple form. But what we are seeing is we're seeing central banks around the world are continuing to buy physical gold at all-time high prices. So what does that historically mean? Well, whenever we see gold purchases on the increase in the climb, that typically signals times of uncertainty, great change, money, increased money printing, currency printing. So when banks, governments just keep printing more and more money, often because what that does is the more money, the more currency that is printed and issued, the value of that goes down because there's so much more of it in circulation. So historically, you will see people flock to gold. They will buy gold, as the flight of safety to hold on to that purchasing power, to hold on to that value. And we have been seeing gold's price really kind of skyrocket over the last couple of years, and for a couple of big reasons. But when we see central banks buying and accumulating incredible amounts of physical gold bullion and also at all-time high prices, then that signals to me, that signals, okay, something is going on. And if history is anything to go on, that history may not repeat perfectly, but it often rhymes. So it can show us, okay, maybe we are in a time of change, great change and uncertainty. We don't have to be scared about that, but we can be aware about some of these signals, and then we can think about what that might mean for you and I and some of the actions we can take. So we are seeing central banks continue to buy gold at all-time high prices. So it's not like they're waiting for gold to they weren't buying this a number of years ago as such when gold was at a much lower price. They are continuing to buy as gold continues to climb. Now, gold has come down over the last 6 to 12 months slightly, but we're seeing gold purchases continue to go up through this time, which is very interesting. So what I want to do is I'm just going to share with you a survey about gold, and just I've highlighted some key points that I think are interesting, and I'm going to link to all the websites and stuff that I'm going to share with you now, so that you can go away, have a read, and if you're interested in this stuff, kind of look at it a bit deeper. But I also encourage you to let me know your thoughts, because if you would like me to do more of a deeper dive on this stuff and actually look into things on a deeper level, then I'm very much up for doing that. So I'm going to look at a survey, and then I'm going to look at some of the countries at the moment that you might be reading about in the news for whatever reason, and just kind of give you a different perspective to potentially look at things. So let me share my screen. So let's start here with the World Gold Council survey. So the World Gold Council basically is this huge organization which fundamentally just tracks gold purchases. And well, they do a lot more than that, but for simple terms, that they track and they survey all to do around gold, because gold is a very, it's been a form of money for thousands of years. It's been respected for literally thousands of years. Looking back at the history of money, you can see the Romans' influence on gold and just how that has ebbed and flowed through the last thousands of years. It's well worth paying attention to gold. So this survey that came out this year, you can go back and look at the 2025 one, because this is very similar. What it is showing you is that central banks continue to buy physical gold, and they're accumulating more and more and more. So that is something really worth paying attention to. I'm just going to quickly scroll down now. The World Gold Council, this survey goes out to central banks all around the world, and they survey them. They ask them questions about their gold purchases, why they're buying gold, are they continuing to buy gold, are they selling gold, and that, because if that's really strong signal. If the central banks are buying or selling gold, it's really worth paying attention to. So I've just highlighted a couple of key highlights that I'm just going to go over quickly. I don't want this to go on for too long, but it's really interesting. So central banks continue to hold very favorable expectations on gold. Respondents overwhelmingly, 89%, believe that global central bank reserves will increase over the next 12 months. So this sounds very similar to the 2025 survey that came out. And again, they continue to buy gold through 2026 and no doubt into 2027, even with gold. Yes, gold has corrected in the last six-ish months, but they continue to accumulate physical gold bullion. This year, a record 45% of respondents expect their gold reserves will also increase. Gold's performance during times of crisis, portfolio diversification, and inflation hedging are some of the key factors for central banks to hold gold. In addition, gold as a geopolitical risk hedge and gold as part of a reserve diversification policy also feature as key reasons for increasing allocations to gold. So going back to that geopolitical tension, going back to some of the things happening in the world, certain countries are at conflict right now. We are seeing really, ever since COVID and the lockdowns, we saw central banks, governments just issue currency at the fastest rate they've ever done. I'm going to quickly talk about the history of money, gold, and how things changed. Because when you see banks issue currency at lightning speed, it loses its value so quickly, and we often see people, organizations, institutions, banks, central banks flock to assets, hard assets, to protect, preserve, and hopefully grow their purchasing power. We're not taught this in school. This is something I have been trying to get my head around more and more over the last few years. The whole COVID thing, looking into that, lockdowns, how things were handled, central banks, governments, it really helped. It blew the lid off a lot of belief systems I had, and made me look into this stuff, because you're not going to read about this in the paper. You're not going to hear about this on mainstream news, but it's very interesting. If we look beyond the curtain, beyond the headlines, what is actually going on in the world and what it can mean for you and I. Anyway, back to the point. So The majority of respondents, 74%, see moderate or significantly lower US dollar holdings within global reserves over the next 5 years. This is really key here. So they see moderate or significantly lower US dollar holdings within global reserves over the next 5 years. Why are they talking about the US dollar? Why are they talking about holding US dollars less and less over the next 5 years? So we can see that central banks around the world are buying and continue to buy and accumulate physical gold bullion during all-time high prices in 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026, and also into 2027 by the look of this survey. So signals times of uncertainty, great change, currency debasement. And now we're hearing about the US dollar and that a lot of central banks are reducing their exposure to the US dollar. Why are we talking about the US dollar here all of a sudden? So a quick history lesson, and I'm going to keep this as concise and short to the point as possible. So many, many years ago, gold was seen as money, and it was a form of money. We then, around World War II, the US was manufacturing lots of goods for the war. They were paid in gold. So a lot of European countries were having firearms, tanks, all that type of stuff, manufactured in the US and shipped over to Europe to help fight World War II. They were paying, obviously, in gold. So the US, because of that, became an absolute superpower. They had a lot of the world's gold reserves. So then after World War II, and a lot of money had been spent to fund the war and stuff, the US now sat with a huge pot of gold. And really, I think was it 1944, something called Bretton Woods, where fundamentally, to keep this one to the point, the US said, hey guys, obviously we've got all this gold. You guys need a hand. What we're going to do is we're in a position, we're going to become the global reserve currency, meaning the US dollar will be seen as the one top currency, the one top form of money in the world, and it will be backed by gold. So then all of a sudden, all these countries, it was in their financial interest, in their favor to hold US dollars, because it meant the US dollar was pegged to gold. So the US dollar holding these paper bills were redeemable for physical gold. So it was very much in their interest to hold US dollars. However, post World War II, post the 1940s, the US went on an absolute money printing spree, and they were only meant to print X amount of dollars for every amount of gold they had. However, the US were just printing and printing and printing, issuing so much new currency that all these countries that were holding US dollars were like, well, hang a minute, you just keep printing all this new currency. Where's the gold? Hang on, we're not confident anymore in the US dollar. We're going to give you these paper bills back, and we want our gold back. It's redeemable for gold, so we want our physical gold back. You can have your paper dollar receipts back. This led into the early 1970s, and then I believe it was 1971, the countries were said, right, enough's enough. France actually sent a warship over across the Atlantic to go redeem a lot of their physical gold. And in that process, the US effectively said, do you know what? We're now taking the US dollar off. We are cancelling the gold, the gold reserve, the gold standard. So literally overnight, all of a sudden, the US dollar no longer was backed up by gold. So what that meant is that all these countries that were holding paper dollars, one day with the expectation to redeem their physical gold, could no longer redeem it for gold because the US ended the gold standard. How that didn't erupt in a global war, I have no idea. But now all these countries hold paper dollars which are no longer backed up by anything. So since 1971, when the gold standard was ended by the US continued to hold all this gold. All these countries now hold paper, which is backed up by nothing. And what has happened is since 1971, the US has continued to go on an absolute spending spree and issuing more and more dollars to become more powerful, to buy new things, to fund many things that we're not going to go into today. So countries continue since 1971 to get even more upset because they've been promised to hold dollars, you're safe, you're good. But the value of the dollar has continued to go down and down and down and down. What has also happened is in 1971 to 1973, the US then said, okay, cool, well, we're no longer backing the US dollar by gold. However, what we're going to do is we're going to back the US dollar by oil, something kind of coined the petrodollar. So the US did basically a bit of a deal with Saudi Arabia where they offered them resources, protection, and a few other things. For Saudi Arabia to basically, because they were one of the biggest distributors of oil, that they would only distribute and sell oil in US dollars. So all of a sudden they jumped from the gold standard to kind of like the petrodollar standard. However, what has happened is the US continued to print and print and print. So people have just fundamentally lost faith in the US dollar, and countries around the world who are big oil producers were only selling in US dollars, but fundamentally what's happened is they've got so upset with the US, they've said, do you know what, we're going to start accepting other currencies, which has created a lot of conflict in the world. If you go back and look at some of the major countries that have some of the highest oil reserves, you will often see a common thread with the US, but that is definitely a conversation for another day. So we're seeing currency debasement, we're seeing gold at all-time high prices being accumulated by central banks. And now this is one of the kind of the meat and bones of one of the most recent things that has been happening over the last few years. And I'm going to talk about BRICS, and not the bricks that you build a house with. I'm talking about BRICS nations. So stay with me. I'm trying to keep this concise, but I can go off on one. It's quite a very interesting thing that you won't hear about is BRICS. So we're talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And there's about 10 or 20 other members that sit underneath the BRICS nations. But fundamentally, BRICS, what is that? Now, that is made up of a group of countries. A lot of them have come from over in the East, but we're now looking at Brazil, South Africa. And these countries are forming an alliance, and they have basically said, "We're really, we're done with the US dollar. We've lost faith in the US dollar. We've lost faith in the US, and we've been doing business in US dollars for decades now, and the value of the dollar just keeps going down. They just keep issuing more and more US dollars. We no longer need to put up with this fundamentally." So BRICS nations, these countries have come together and they are now forming an alliance known as BRICS nations. Now, funny enough, these countries, or a lot of these countries, are very rich in resources. So we're talking about land, oil, gas, the minerals in the ground, the gold in the ground. So these countries are, most of them are very rich in commodities and assets. So now all of a sudden they are looking to do business in other currencies. Now that might not sound like a big deal, but if you are the US and you sit pretty much to a certain extent at the top of the food chain as the global reserve standard for many, many, many years, and now all of a sudden all these countries are going, hang on, you know, we don't want to play ball with this anymore. You're destroying the currency. So we're going to start doing our own business over here. Naturally, that's going to create some friction. And if you look at some of the conflicts going on in the world, predominantly that's look at Iran. Now, obviously, the official narrative is that the US, to do with some of the Islamic regime, the humanitarian issues going on in Iran. I don't doubt that is going on, and that hopefully there is peace brought to Iran over that. But also, Iran is one of the biggest countries in the world rich in resources, predominantly oil and gas, and obviously there's a lot of minerals in the ground. So there seems to be a common denominator between some of these countries that the US show interest in. That's all I'm going to say. So, what I want to kind of bring this back to, because I've kind of gone off on one here, is as we see gold prices continue to go up, we're seeing the value of the dollar go down and down and down through the amount of currency being issued. We're seeing other countries in the world forming alliances and, creating other opportunities for other countries that have relied on the US and the US dollar for so many years. Naturally, this is going to create some friction, which we are seeing. So, yes, we might get a mainstream narrative behind why certain countries are showing interest in other countries, but also look beyond the headline. Look at, and this really kind of, for me, was a big eye opener. When you see countries showing interest in other countries, think about the resources in that country and what those resources mean. So, BRICS nations, keeping an eye on BRICS nations and their developments, I think I completely, I hand on my heart, I think this is a really big, huge one to pay attention to, because what they're also doing is BRICS are developing their own payment system. Now, for many years, the world has used the SWIFT payments, cross-border payment system known as SWIFT, which the US pretty much control, and they choose who can use SWIFT and who can't use SWIFT. Whereas BRICS are creating a whole new payment system, and all these countries are flocking to it now, and all these different currencies can be used cross-border, which might not sound like a big deal, but it's a huge, huge deal, because what that's doing is that's taking away the dependency on the US and the US dollar. So we have been told throughout life and in school that you save your money, save pounds, euros, dollars, whatever your currency is. But banks, governments love to just print this stuff into oblivion. So it loses value. And for every $1 or £1 that was used to buy that loaf of bread, now there's 10, 20, 50, £100, dollars, euros buying that same piece of bread, let's say, loaf of bread, and it pushes prices up. And what we typically see is as banks and governments just print, we see a lot of people that obviously have money will put their money into assets to preserve their value, to preserve their purchasing power, which drives up the value, the cost of these assets. So from an investment standpoint, fantastic. You're preserving your purchasing power, and you're holding assets that are going up in value. But for many of us that hold pounds, euros, dollars, and just have some money in the bank, or we're working really bloody hard to make money, but the value of that keeps going down. By exploring this, looking at this, we start to see the signals, we start to see the noise. They leave clues about different assets and different ways that we can potentially hold value and, make value, increase our purchasing power. So we can continue to look at central banks' behavior around physical gold. We can continue to look at BRICS nations and the developments around these countries. And also, we don't even have to look at any headlines and do any research. This might not be of interest to you, but what we can do is we can often look at the price. We can look at a chart and we can look at the price of different assets to understand where price could go and what's happening in the world. So one thing I like to do from time to time is I like to go to something called TradingView, and I like to track different assets just for entertainment and educational purposes, because often there's this famous saying that goes something along the lines of, don't tell me the news, show me the charts and I'll tell you the news. And Let me just jump over here now. So this is the price action. This is gold, and it's priced in dollars. This chart is. And what that means is you can forget about all the headlines, or because a lot of that is often confusing and misleading. But what you can do is you can go to the chart, and obviously some people get interested in this, some people don't. Totally cool. We don't have to look at this stuff, or I can do specific video walkthroughs of this stuff because this helps cut out the noise. I don't need to look at the headlines. I can look at the chart, and the chart can tell me kind of what's going on to a certain extent. And so what we can do is, for instance, we've seen literally for years and years, gold has just been in this kind of boring channel. It's just been ranging in this channel for a good number of years. And then what we saw here back in really end of 2023, beginning of 2024, we saw the gold's price just break out of this long ranging channel and just go on an absolute tear. So this crash, this correction here was to be expected. Nothing goes up in a straight line for too long. Things always need to cool off. And what's been happening is we've seen the price start to go back up again. So did we see a big rise in central banks buying? Did we see a bit of a cooling off period? And now are we seeing central banks and also retail? So we're, more everyday people are some people are aware of what's going on in the world, so they're buying gold. They're like friends of mine, they're buying gold, they're buying silver to preserve that purchasing power. So I'm trying to not get too carried away here, but gold, BRICS nations, looking at the charts, these are just different ways to accumulate more insight, more information. And then what we can do with that is we can then look at what that could mean, what it means historically, and what it can mean moving forward, because money is important. Money gives us options. Money can help give us freedom. I'm not, money doesn't always buy happiness. No, it doesn't, but it can give us options and opportunity. And by looking at a few of these things that you probably are never going to hear about in mainstream media, it can just build our perspective. And then we can think, okay, cool. Well, we're seeing central banks, we're seeing countries, we're seeing big institutions show a lot of interest in these different assets. Okay, why are they? What can that mean? And potentially, if we want to increase our purchasing power, increase our monetary value so that we can have more options potentially in life, then maybe I might want to look at some of these asset classes as well. Maybe not. But it would be, I think it would be irresponsible of me not to bring awareness to this, because a lot of us all have money. We all have money in the bank. We all live on this planet. I think we all live on this planet. So to understand what some of the big countries and banks are doing, even just to have that awareness in your head, I think is really, really important. Anyway, I am very happy to dive into this deeper. This was meant to be a bit of an overview, but I kind of just went absolute off on one. I'm gonna now. What I'll do is I will link to the central bank survey and to this article. Trade and View, you can set up a free account, you can do a paid account, and we could totally do walkthroughs and kind of look at some of these different asset classes and just think and question why the price might be going up or why the price might be going down. We can zoom out, we can look at history, see what history taught us and what it can mean moving forward, and then we can look for the potential opportunity and the challenges around this and what our options may or may not be. So I pardon me. Anyway, I've gone on an absolute tear. This was meant to be about a 10-minute video. I definitely think I've gone on more than 10 minutes. So I've touched on all the things I wanted to and probably a bit more, but I hope that brought some value. Again, please share with me your thoughts, any insights you have, and if there's anything that didn't make sense, you didn't know, you found interesting, maybe you want to challenge me on some points, please do. And if there's anything you would like me to explore on a deeper level, because for me, over the last few years, I really did lose all trust and faith in mainstream media. I really wanted to go beyond the curtain, go beyond the headlines, and look and kind of start educating myself and look at other people and platforms for information, and then go back in history and look at what some of these events have meant in the past and what they can mean for us today. So for me, I'm navigating this in real time. I'm sharing it with you in real time. But I just think it's been so eye-opening for me. You know, by understanding some of this, it can fundamentally help us, to become more equipped, more educated, so we can live well in these somewhat changing times. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope you got something from that video. Let me know. I hope you have a great weekend ahead, and I look forward to catching up with you in the coming days and weeks. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the weather, and I'll catch you guys soon.